Welcome, everybody, to the UC UK Chats Ukraine Conflict panel. Thank you very much for your time, for joining us today or tonight, depending on where you are. My name is Jason Mullering. I'm the president of UC Alumni UK. We are co-hosting this with the University of California Trust UK. If you're not familiar with this group, what we are is a community of up to 30,000 people at last count in the UK and also into the European Union that provides professional, social, and lifelong learning opportunities. UC UK Chats, which this is very much one of those lifelong learning opportunities where we have access to University of California experts, and we have a fantastic panel tonight. And obviously this session is very timely, it's critical, and unlike other alumni groups in the UK, this is on our doorstep, so it's much more poignant for us. This group is going to help give us some context and then also talk about where things are going. It's a real honor to have this panel, but I'm going to let our moderator introduce them in time, but I just want to introduce Ryan Chilcote, who is our moderator. Ryan is a journalist, a broadcaster, a moderator, a consultant, and a PBS NewsHour special correspondent with a very deep understanding of Russia, and he also went to UC Santa Cruz. So Ryan, we're very delighted to have you. Thank you very much for doing this, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jason. Go banana slugs. That's my little plug for UC Santa Cruz right there. Deep understanding, that's very kind. Not as deep of an understanding as our distinguished panelists, I think it's fair to say. So really looking forward to speaking with them in just a few moments. For all of you that have joined, welcome to the Ukraine Conflict panel. As Jason was saying there, my name is Ryan Chilcote. I'm a proud graduate of UC Santa Cruz, and I'm really honored to be leading this discussion representing UC Santa Cruz. I am a lifelong watcher of Russia and the former Soviet Union. I've been doing that for just over 32 years now, since I rocked up there as a high school exchange student and then as a University of California exchange student back in 1994. Then a CNN correspondent based in Moscow, then a Bloomberg TV correspondent that spent a great deal of time in Russia, and now a PBS NewsHour special correspondent, as Jason was saying there. The goal of our conversation really today is to try and get a little bit better understanding of the context and the implications of what's happening in Ukraine. I think we can all agree that in many ways, the implications of what's taking place are profound. Another goal is to discuss ways that you can get involved should you want to do that. And finally, the goal of this panel really is to give you an opportunity to ask the questions you want to directly to our panelists. And the way you can do that is you go in the Zoom window there to the bottom where it says the chat, use the chat function and type in your question and press send. And we will make sure that your question gets asked. If you help me out by, if you've got it, you want to address it to anyone specifically, let us know, but we'll make sure your questions get asked. You are welcome, and we would encourage you to ask questions. So enough of that prelude. As I was saying, we have a rock star panel for you today, including, and I'm going to go through the list here, Distinguished Professor Emeritus Benjamin Cohen, coming to us from UC Santa Barbara. Thank you, Professor.
Good to see you.
Yeah, he will be providing some political and economic perspective, like perhaps no one else can. University of California, Riverside's Professor Georg Michels, who will be giving us some historical context. Thank you, Professor Michels, for joining us. UCR alumna Sonia Slavinsky, who will share her experience as a volunteer on the Polish-Ukrainian border. Sonia, thank you for being with us. And I hope maybe also share some thoughts about how this might affect the energy transition and the road to net zero that we keep talking about after COP26. with her ESG hat on, which she wears here in London. So thanks, Sonia. And last but not least, we've got Klaus Gomez Stimmeter, who, where are you, Klaus? There you are. Yeah, who is a UCLA alumnus, a student at Oxford, where he's getting his master's in migration studies, and a reporter on the ground, joining us from an Airbnb, if I got that correct, in Odessa, in Ukraine, doing the good work of providing eyewitness reporting from Ukraine itself. He's working for a number of media outlets there, including the Austrian daily Wiener Zeitung, if I got that slightly correct, which for those of you who are not in the know is not just an Austrian daily, but also holds the title for being the world's oldest newspaper that's still being published. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you. It's nice to see our audience here. Thanks for joining us as well, everyone who's participating and listening to this panel. Klaus, I want to start with you because you are on the ground. So I guess maybe we should start with the eyewitness part, like in Odessa, before we get into the kind of the news. What's it like? What are you seeing there in Odessa?
I mean, today here in Ukraine, and especially here in Odessa, all eyes today are what's happening in Transnistria, this breakaway region of Moldova, which has effectively been controlled by Russia since 1992. Ever since I arrived here a month ago, there was this fear that the Russians would activate their troops there. There's an estimated number around 1,500 troops there, and they would unite with this small army that Transnistria itself has, which is estimated to be around 8,500. So I'm emphasizing the word estimated because no one really knows if these numbers are true, but that's like the consensus among the military experts here. So yeah, I mean, what has been happening this week just across the border, which is only about a 90-minute drive from Odessa, is definitely on the minds of people here. There have been several incidents. On Tuesday, 2 radio antennas were blown up, which had been used by radio stations broadcasting Russian channels. There were reports that there was a bomb attack on the headquarters of the state security agency in Tiraspol, which is the capital of Transnistria. And apparently yesterday and today, the people living there have been getting text messages that the Ukrainian army is about to invade Transnistria, which the Ukrainians, of course, are strongly denying. And there are no reasons why they would invade. But so this is obviously all staged, bears pretty much all the hallmarks of a false flag operation. But this is what's happening. And last but not least, the Russians just fired 2 rockets at a bridge, one yesterday afternoon and one only this morning, which completely destroyed that bridge. And that bridge was like, this bridge connects the whole region of Odessa to the region that is on the Romanian border. So it's this bridge which is just below the Dniester River. So now that region has been effectively cut off. So yeah, in the light of all of these current developments, and after this weekend where the city just started to recover from the last rocket attack in which 8 people died, among them a 3-month-old baby. Yeah, I mean, things have been getting increasingly tense.
And how far are you from, I mean, as you say, there are rocket attacks on Odessa, but how far are you from the front lines, so to speak?
The front line is in Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv is this city, which it's a pretty big city. It's about 500,000 people. At least that was the count before the war started. And the front line is actually at Mykolaiv, which is roughly about 70 miles just up the coast from here.
And yet, obviously, the effects of the war are already very apparent and being felt there in Odessa. And that's just a little snippet of what's going on, right? We still have the siege in Mariupol. Many Ukrainian troops holed up in the steel factory there, surrounded by Russian forces. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was in Moscow. I think he's on his way to Ukraine, right, to try and organize at least the evacuation of civilians that are apparently in those steelworks. And that's not it. I want to bring in Professor Cohen, if I might, because in addition to all of that, over the last 24 hours, Russia has churned off the supply of natural gas to two EU countries, Poland and Bulgaria. Professor Cohen, what's going on?
Well, I can only express my own opinions because I don't have contacts within the Russian government. But what it seems to me is fairly clear is that the Russians are demonstrating with Poland and Bulgaria, demonstrating one of the few cards they have left in the economic conflict that is going on parallel to the military conflict. The West has imposed a whole variety of sanctions, as we all know. We could talk about those if you like. The Russians, in turn, have their own cards to play. And of course, the biggest card they have is energy, to a small extent, coal, but to a much larger extent, oil and natural gas. The Polish market for Russia, the Polish market and the Bulgarian markets are relatively small. They don't lose a lot from cutting off exports of oil, of natural gas to those two countries. But it does demonstrate that they have the capacity to inflict a lot more damage on some of the major players in Western Europe. And in particular, of course, we're talking about Germany, which before all of this began, something like 60% of its natural gas consumption was coming from Russia. It's clear that the Russians are signaling that they still have some effective instruments to put into play.
Well, I would like to come back to the sanctions and the politics that are afoot. But before we do that, Professor Michels, if I could bring you into the conversation, I'd like to, at the risk of this all getting a little bit schizophrenic, back up for a second to February 24th, when this all began, when the first Russian troops moved into Ukraine proper, for a lack of a better way of putting it, because it's quite possible that Russia already had at least some troops in the Russian separatist, Russia Kremlin-backed territory in the northeast, in Donetsk. But I wanted to ask you about one of the reasonings that that we've been given for this intervention by Russian President Vladimir Putin, because we've been given several, but because you're a professor of history, perhaps you could unpack the reason for this conflict that President Putin has said, which is that effectively this is really Russian territory that the West has moved in on and has sort of duped the Ukrainians into thinking it could be part of the West or should be part of the West.
Yes. Putin claims he's a historian himself. He was never trained as a historian. He reads popular history books. He uses history as a weapon. And of course, his version of history is full of lies and distortions and fabrications. And it's, I think, history and historical mythologies and lies mobilized by Putin, and incidentally, not just by him, but by a gigantic propaganda machine. And believed, unfortunately, now by a large majority of Russians, is that Ukraine never was an independent state, has no nation, there's no Ukrainian nation, there's no Ukrainian culture, there is no Ukrainian language. This is one of the greatest lies of all this conflict. It's used to justify genocide. not just the destruction of the Ukrainian state, but what we're seeing is the destruction of an entire people and entire culture. Where does this come from? It's nothing new. It goes back to the 17th and 18th century when Russia was poised to conquer territories that historically were either independent as a state called Rus in the Middle Ages, or then became part of Poland and Lithuania and later the Habsburg Empire. So it's very much an imperialist ideology that's based on the denigration and dehumanization of an entire people and culture. What we're seeing, in my opinion, is history being mobilized as a weapon of destruction and extermination. To me, it's horrifying.
Did you, I mean, you've spent your entire life studying the history of conflict between Russia, Ukraine, between these empires. Did you think that it might come to this? Did you anticipate this?
It's nothing new. I anticipated this for the first time when the Chechnya invasion happened. I lost 2 close friends from Chechnya in this. This is the early 2000s when Putin was elevated into office to take care, to solve, to offer the final solution. He uses this kind of word, I mean, you know, which we associate with Hitler, of course. Now it's the final solution, not of the Chechen problem, but of the Ukrainian problem. And when you look at the history of Ukraine in the 20th century, you're dealing with one of the most tragic histories of any people in the world. We're dealing with the attempted genocide of the Ukrainian peasantry by Stalin, the artificial famine of the 1930s, when Stalin basically this is tried again, starvation of people in the cities and so on, where more than almost 4 million people died. We're dealing, of course, also with World War I and the aftermath of the revolutions when Russian troops went into Ukraine, which had declared its independence, incidentally. It was not an invention of Lenin. It had declared its independence in 1918, and then the Bolshevik Red Army moved in, the White Army too, and committed, something similar as what's happening today. So it's nothing new. I am shocked by what's happening, but as a historian, I have seen this before.
And in the interest of sharing, perspectives or the views of both sides, the Russians, you'll be well aware, say that in fact the Ukrainians were committing genocide against ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. What do you say to that?
Wonderful, well, a terrible lie, of course. There's no evidence for this, but daily we see the evidence of what the Russians are doing. Incidentally, the first line of the Ukrainian national anthem, which was written in the 1830s, reads like this: Ukraine has not yet perished. So this is a reflection of Ukraine and Ukrainians' amazing resilience to have maintained and developed their own culture, their own nationality, despite repeated and long-standing Russian nationalist, and I should say nationalist, attempts to destroy Ukrainian identity.
Sonia, you traveled to the Ukrainian-Polish border to volunteer there. Take us there. What does it look like? What's the situation look like at the border?
Yeah, so I was able to go to Medica for a few days a few weeks ago, and I think you kind of see what the things you see on TV and how horrible it is, and then wanting to help. I'm not alone in that, and I know everyone would want to do something and be able to be involved. But I think a lot of the things I was able to see at the border were quite true of what was of what we were seeing on TV. It was kind of like there were American military going into Ukraine with kind of an engagement of wanting to go and help, and they were meeting someone at the point where we were, and just individuals with their kind of kit and saying, do you have a military background? Okay, come this way, come with me, which was just, that was an insane thing to watch. I don't know how I feel about that, but and the people
Is
that
that
were
not
coming.
like, yeah, American military going there of their own volition, not as
Yeah.
not deployed by President Biden?
No, just, yeah, not deployed at all, just individuals with their, presumably they're in the military, they might be in the reserves, I'm not sure. But we saw several people going through into Ukraine. Also, like the kind of, I was expecting it to be very kind of manic and chaotic and very desperate people coming through, but it was very calm, but a lot of people coming through, like hundreds a day, and it was only women and their children. The men from ages, I think 16 to 60 weren't allowed to come through. They have to stay in Ukraine, which is just, we saw them kind of, we went into Ukraine to provide food to those that were in line on the passport side, because they had to stand in line for hours to come through and be processed, and they were with big families. And the men were having to stay on the other side, and it was, you know, tears and heartbreak of the women coming through without their husbands. And some of the other things we saw were like people were coming with just, you know, enough clothes like what we'd pack for a Ryanair flight, but then they'd have their cat or their dog. So like they knew they were going for a long time, but they weren't even able to carry physically their, you know, how much possessions, and God knows how long they had to travel to even get to the border, if they were even dropped off, or how that side of it looked. But everyone, I was shocked at how calm they all seemed. I guess a lot of it is kind of that the craziness of having to come through the border, and then they get to go to a refugee camp for 2 nights, and then they have to decide if they're going to stay there or where they would go after that. And that's where people, it really hits them of what's actually happening. But yeah, it was shocking to see. It wasn't what I expected at all.
Professor Cohen, you heard Sonia there talking about the volunteers coming in, even American, you know, military, maybe ex-military, going into Ukraine. Of course, we were just talking about with Professor Michels the historical component to this, but another issue that President Putin talks about a lot is how Ukraine, if not nominally, has de facto become kind of a NATO country. So I wanted to get your take on that, and what we're to make of kind of recent development over the last couple of weeks, where the U.S. now appears to be sending, you know, by the day, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of military equipment into Ukraine, when, you know, just 3 months ago, you know, no one really wanted to provide too much concrete military support.
Well, if we flash back to the week or so before the invasion began, journalistic sources, no disrespect intended, but journalistic sources were unanimous, it seems, that the Russians had an overwhelming advantage, and that Ukraine would fall in a very short time. It followed logically, therefore, that the US government wasn't going to invest a great deal in supporting a lost cause. The Ukrainians proved them wrong, proved a lot of people wrong, by putting up not only a stiff resistance, but by actually taking the initiative in many cases. And it then became an opportunity for the West, led by the United States, to inflict significant harm on Russia by supporting the Ukrainians. Russia has accused the United States of making this a proxy war. In a sense, in that sense, it has become a proxy war, in the sense that the Ukrainians are the ones who are fighting the Russians, but are serving not just their own interests, but as it happens, serving the interests of NATO as well. I think that it's very clear that the United States and its allies in NATO and the others who met in Berlin just this past week, just the other day, it's become clear that this is a real opportunity to in effect, teach Putin a lesson, and hopefully curb any further desire that he may have for trying to invade or intimidate countries on his border. The Ukrainians are not, as we know, are not a formal member of NATO, but NATO has always had relations with countries that are not formal members, but are closely allied in terms of military operations. Countries like Austria, Finland, even Sweden. And Ukraine has now fallen in that category. It's a form of partnership without the advantage of full membership. I think that if we look forward to what might eventually be the outcome of all of this, I think it's fairly clear that the Ukrainians are willing to give up their desire for full formal membership of NATO. That doesn't mean Finlandization. It doesn't mean that they would be absolutely neutral, but it means that they would have a lesser arrangement with NATO, which would not give them the advantage of the famous Article 5, that the attack on one is an attack on all. The Ukrainians, I think, are prepared to give up that option. They're not prepared to give up the option of membership of the European Union, and that I think is going to happen in fairly short order.
Yeah, can I just jump in? I mean, it is often said by at least a minority of political scientists in this country, including John Mearsheimer, that it was not NATO expansion that provoked Putin to go in. That's part of the story. I'm not saying this is not true, but I think it goes much deeper. There were two genuine popular revolutions in Ukraine that never occurred in Russia, in the Orange Revolution of 2004, and then, of course, the Maidan Revolution of 2014, when Putin's friends, including his cronies, oligarchs, and Yanukovych, who was his friend and now obviously is operating in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, were removed. When Lenin statues were removed all over Ukraine, when traditional communist like cities were renamed and so on, and when elections were freely, were free, unlike in Russia, were staged. I think Putin is terrified, and so is the oligarchic establishment, basically a leftover from the old communist system. In Russia, the old nomenclatura, the old privileged class was not destroyed, despite perestroika. Gorbachev tried, but it certainly was destroyed in Ukraine in 2014. That is what Putin is principally afraid of, I think, of a truly democratic state right next door. And Russians are observing it. Many Russians going to Kiev, when they still were able to do this, are amazed how different Kiev is from Moscow.
Klaus, I want to bring you in for a bit here. There's this perception in widely held view in the West that all Ukrainians are orientated towards the West, want to join, as we just heard, the European Union, wouldn't mind joining NATO, though it doesn't appear to be on the cards. You're on the ground. What are people telling you?
Obviously, it's more complicated. If I may, just to defend my profession, what Professor Cohen said, the journalists wrote about it that way, that the Ukrainians have no chance, because that's what the military experts told them. So they were just the messenger of what the military experts told them. I spoke to several military experts from Austria, the UK, and the US, and there was an anonymous judgment that this would last like 2 weeks max. So I'm just saying, because journalists were, because that's what the experts told them. Number one. Number two, what Sonia said, I crossed the border on foot in Przemysl, And it was the only people that crossed with me in that direction were North Americans. All ex-military, and they were immediately, there was a big tent. The first thing that you come across when you cross the border on foot at that checkpoint is a big tent where it says International Foreign Legion. And every day that I spoke to these guys who welcomed them in, every day they were telling me every single day there are at least 2-3 dozen people, mostly vast majority from the US or Canada, joining the International Legion. So it was a thing before Malcolm Nance went over there. To your question, Ryan, as briefly as quickly, because it ties in, it kind of ties into what Professor Michels said. The most striking thing to me every time I get to talk to people here in their late 20s and 30s, so the first generation that grew up in an independent Ukraine, how they perceive what is going on. There is a quote I keep hearing in these conversations that always comes up, and that quote is February 24th. So the day when the Russian invasion started, that was our real Independence Day. So not August 24th, 1991, when Ukraine officially became an independent country. Many of them weren't even born yet, but February 24th, 2022, when Ukraine took up arms to fight back the Russians. So, and the other thing I keep hearing from members of that generation is, and that ties into what Professor Michels brought up before. There's a very vivid thing, like we learned Ukrainian history in school, and therefore they aren't surprised. Because, and that's a verbatim quote, every time we get up and are about to make something of ourselves, the Russians are tearing us down. It's always been that way. So yeah, at least from what I've been gathering here in Odessa is that there is this kind of consciousness among this post-Soviet Union generation, and not just among the ones who are necessarily highly educated, you know, not just the ones who went to college. Like for them, this is a thread that runs straight from the Tsars who banned the Ukrainian language, to the Bolsheviks to crush the independent movement, to the Holodomor, to the oppression in the late Soviet period, and then the Maidan Revolution. And they look at this war as just the latest manifestation of this running thread that runs throughout Ukrainian history. So, and just two last sentences on this. They are not necessarily oriented towards the EU or the US. They're very self-conscious. They're like they want to do their own thing. Yeah, I mean that's at least my impression. They are very aware of what's going on, what has been going on in the US, especially in the last couple of years politically. So, and they're of course, they're Western oriented, but they're also a generation that is very disillusioned. So yeah, it's a very interesting, it's like they perceive what's going on in the most interesting ways, you know, that you wouldn't think of. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Can I just interject? We need to be a little careful. There are a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine. It's not an ethnic nationalism, unlike the Russian nationalism, which is Great Russian and Eastern Orthodox Russian. I'm always surprised that many of the victims I hear are speaking Russian, particularly from Eastern Ukraine, and you will see the same in Odessa, I'm sure. And it's interesting that most of these Russians, totally contradicting Putin, I would say 95% of these Russians are pro-independent Ukraine. That greatly distinguishes Ukrainian state and nation from Russia, which is a chauvinist country.
Professor Michels, interesting you bring that up, because one of the things obviously you've written a lot about is the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church, which maybe not everyone in our audience realizes actually has a sizable presence in Ukraine. There are many Ukrainian nationals, even ethnic Ukrainians, who follow the Russian Orthodox Church and believe that the Russian Orthodox Church is the true church of Orthodoxy. We just had Orthodox Easter, and we heard from the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church blessing President Putin and effectively, reiterating something that he said since the beginning of this military conflict, that this is effectively right, that this is this is Orthodox, a battle that the Orthodox should be fighting to push back the sort of heretics and evils of the West.
Yeah, it's a holy war. That's how he talks about it. The evil West is decadent. It support. He talks. He's
Gay rights.
With gay rights. I mean, it's gay bashing. The West is full of pedophiles. I mean, and so on. I mean, it's totally irrational. It has very little to do with the beauty of Eastern Orthodox religion. And most recently, and Putin and both Kirill were there, the main church to the armed forces in Moscow was opened. I don't know if you've been there. I would encourage PBS to go there with their cameras, because it's, first of all, a sanctification of Russian military victories in World War II. But it goes back all the way into the Middle Ages, and it's always Russian saints that are working together with Russian military leaders to defeat the evil invaders, whether it's the French, Napoleon, whether it's the Germans, or whether it's the Mongols, whether it's the Poles, and so on. So this whole history, which is tragic, of invasions that Russia has faced, that Ukraine has faced as well, is glorified as a history of Russian sanctification by the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church and by more than 40,000 priests. One of the most shocking things for me is only that 300 priests have dared to speak out. The hierarchy is completely silent. Now, the situation with Orthodoxy in Ukraine is much more complicated, because we now have an independent Ukrainian church. And even the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is no longer really, it's split, it's deeply split. There are those in the hierarchy who still support Kirill in Moscow, but many on the ground, under pressure from their communities, are now turning away from the Patriarch in Moscow.
Thank you, Professor Michals. I'm really happy that we're covering so much ground, some of which doesn't really get covered too much in the media. So that's fantastic. And also, Professor Michals, great that you brought up, I'm not sure that I've got the pronunciation correct here, but Professor Mearsheimer and his comments about Ukraine, this idea that actually the United States, an idea that he has championed, that actually it's the United States that's to blame for what's going on in Ukraine because it pushed NATO too hard, because that was one of the questions from our audience, was what do our speakers think about that view, that in fact it is the United States that's to blame for what's happening in Ukraine and being overly aggressive. And Professor Cohen, getting back to you, another question that we got, which we started to get into, is you started to answer rather, is there a solution here that ends with a peaceful withdrawal of Russian troops, or has President Putin gone too far to crawl back? So, I mean, you started to say that the Ukrainians are prepared to accept something short of NATO membership, which no one's offering anyway, by the way, right? But what is the answer to that question? Is there a way to de-escalate these things? Because the other thing we had in the news today was, or in the last 24 hours anyway, was the Russian foreign minister saying, hey, if the US continues, we could have a third world war with nuclear weapons.
It's not outside the realm of possibility, regrettably.
Yeah. What do you think the probability of the use of ICBMs? what are we talking about in percentage?
I don't see anything. An ICBM would be for intercontinental warfare, not for warfare across a common border.
Right.
But the Russians, like the United States, have a huge number of tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, that can be scaled up or down to be a very low yield, or can be scaled up to a higher yield. I personally, I think the probability of resort to nuclear weapons is extremely low, but it's not zero, regrettably. It's clear that Putin is facing a major humiliation, and it is not outside the realm of possibility that as a last desperate act, he might, to avoid humiliation, he might indeed make use of tactical weapons. But as I say, I attach a low probability to that. He has many options for ending this this conflict. If the Ukrainians are as successful at resisting advances by the Russians, if they are as successful in the Donbass and in southern Ukraine as they were in the north around Kyiv, it's entirely possible that he would do what many American generals were recommending in Vietnam: declare victory and leave. It's entirely possible that having established control of the Donbass and some of the southern area of Ukraine, he might say, well, we've achieved our objective of protecting our ethnic brothers from genocide, and declare victory. I think that would be the most face-saving way for him to get out of this conflict. Whether he takes it, though, is another matter. To build on something that Professor Michels was saying, I have no doubt that he worries about the precedent of color revolutions in Georgia and elsewhere, and certainly the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine, and worries about how that might affect political events inside Russia itself. But I think we have to acknowledge that, in a sense, there's much more going on here than that. Putin has a 19th century way of approaching geopolitics. He thinks in terms of great powers. This is really what political scientists call realism, and Mearsheimer is an example of that as well. Putin thinks in terms of a world divided up among the great powers, each of whom has its own sphere of influence. And he wants to have an outcome that would acknowledge Russia's role as one of the great powers with its own sphere of interest and influence, which, of course, would include Georgia and Ukraine, as well as other areas. If he were to be allowed to declare that by defending the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, if he were allowed to say without opposition from the West that he has accomplished his task, we might have a way out of this conflict. But I'm not sure that that would be accepted by either the West or by the Ukraine government.
Yeah, I'm not sure it will be accepted by Russian society, which has been greatly manipulated by the propaganda machine. I agree with you. It's a humiliating performance of the Russian army. We don't quite know how many Russian soldiers have already died, but funerals are taking place, sometimes mass funerals of soldiers in the same community. And I just don't see, plus this really paranoid, almost apocalyptical ideology that Putin has embraced, which I would almost compare to the lunacies of Nazi ideology. I think make it impossible for him to declare a compromise. And I agree with you that this is imperial thinking. The only problem is that Putin is in denial. This is no longer the Soviet Union. This is no longer the Tsarist Empire. If at all, it's much more like Moscow, the Moscow state in the 15th and 16th century. And of course, Putin loves Ivan the Terrible. And in many ways, it would make sense to compare him to Putin. Ivan, by the way, is right next to Putin in his grave in the Cathedral of the Assumption, maybe 200 meters from Putin's villa in the Kremlin. And Putin often is seen in the cathedrals of the Kremlin, where he says prayers and lights candles and so on.
Well,
I don't know.
I agree.
Yeah,
I
sorry.
agree with you. I agree with you, Darren, that he is highly unrealistic in thinking that Russia can be considered the great power that he believes Russia to be. The size of the Russian economy is remarkably small for a country of, what is it, 6 million square miles. It sometimes has been called Upper Volta with nuclear weapons. The GNP, or the gross domestic product of Russia, is smaller than that of South Korea, if you want to make a comparison. His ambitions are not matched by the actual resources available to the Russian state. There's no question about that. But it's not, we're dealing with a degree of irrationality. It's irrational ambition that is the issue. And that has to be accommodated in some way if this is to be resolved without further bloodshed, or with less bloodshed than otherwise.
Klaus, I want to get to you soon, but before I do, Professor Cohen, I want to come back to where we started with you, which was by discussing energy, and particularly it was Russia suspending natural gas exports to Bulgaria and Poland. Because when you talk about the ways that the United States and the West are trying to influence Russia and Vladimir Putin's behavior right now, obviously the sanctions and sanctions on energy is a big part of that. So the U.S. has banned Russian crude oil imports to the United States, but never really imported that much anyway, right? But it looks like the Europeans are getting closer to something like that too.
Yeah. There are three separate products: coal, oil, natural gas. Russia exports relatively little coal to Western Europe. So it was painless for the Europeans, for the West Europeans, to say, we're not going to buy any more coal from Russia. It's significant that despite all the headlines about what has been done in terms of sanctions, every day Europe is buying natural gas and oil from Russia and paying dollars for that. Russia is making hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue, even at the same time that these nations are arming Russia's enemy, namely Ukraine. The panoply of sanctions that have been imposed by the West are impressive, but they have left off the table for now those two products, natural gas and oil, which are really key. There's no question that the Russian economy has been significantly impacted negatively by the sanctions. But as long as they are able to continue to sell oil and natural gas, they will be able to keep the economy from crashing. The real issue for the West is whether they're willing to take the cost of cutting off purchases of oil and natural gas. It's not coal, it's oil and natural gas. And the interests of the Europeans, unfortunately, are fragmented. Some countries are much more dependent than others. Spain and Portugal buy little or nothing from Russia in terms of natural gas or oil. Germany and Italy, on the other hand, are much more highly dependent, as I suggested earlier. And that, of course, helps to explain why it is that the NATO countries have not been able to unify on the issue of denying Russia the markets for their oil and natural gas. In a sense, there's a game of chicken going on. The West is threatening, but has yet to actually implement a cutoff of purchases of oil and natural gas. The Russians, by the signal they send with their ban on oil exports to Poland and Bulgaria, the Russians are signaling that they're prepared to take the cost of doing without exports of these products. It's a game of chicken, and it's an open question as to which will blink first.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. And I should point out that if I've got this correct, we have a former Secretary of Energy for the United States actually in the audience, the former Chancellor of UC Riverside. So thank you very much, Mr. Orbach, for joining us. It's good to have you here. Klaus, I want to, since we got into Western Europe and the reluctance of some Western European countries to go it without Russian natural gas. I mean, as someone from a country that is somewhat ambivalent about the conflict due to its, self-declared neutrality and that dependence on Russian natural gas, how do you reconcile, what's going on where you are and how it's perceived back home?
Well, what goes on in Austria in terms of national security has always been a kind of a mystery to me. You're in London, I'm pretty sure you saw this Financial Times article from like 2 weeks ago where Austria was called, an aircraft carrier of Russian intelligence, and to me, it's absolutely bewildering what the politicians in my country are doing. The thing that I consider the weirdest in Austria specifically is there is this consensus among pretty much every party that nobody wants to touch this neutrality thing, even if it has effectively gone out the window when Austria joined the EU in 1994. Austria is in the Partnership for Peace with NATO. So it's like it would just be like about the last step. And in a situation like this, I mean, I can't think of, I don't have as much life experience as Professor Cohen or Professor Michels, but in my lifetime, I cannot remember a conflict that was more black and white. So I don't see what neutrality means in the context of this war. Because if you are neutral in this war, there is something seriously wrong with you. That's just me. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, still having an Austrian passport, quite frankly, it makes me feel ashamed.
Yeah.
Could I just comment on that? I think that Klaus, I'm a bit older than you, and I remember the circumstances in which Austria regained its sovereignty after World War II. It was by a formal treaty. Germany remained split between the different occupied sectors. Austria avoided that same consequence by agreeing to a formal treaty which formally obligates Austria to remain neutral. They would therefore be breaking a commitment under an internationally recognized treaty to join NATO. This is different from Finland, for example, whose neutrality was was not embodied in a formal treaty.
Mhm.
Okay,
I
I'm sorry, I just have to correct that. It is a self-imposed neutrality. It doesn't break international law if Austria would join NATO. That's the biggest misunderstanding about Austrian neutrality. Austrian can't join NATO whenever it wants to. It would not break international law.
No, it's not a matter of breaking international law. It's breaking the terms of a treaty that enabled Austria to regain its formal sovereignty.
Mhm. I was in Vienna, incidentally, Klaus, I was in Vienna in the early 1990s. I'm a little older than you, and I remember the refugees from Yugoslavia, and many of them were Bosnian Muslims and Croat Catholics who had survived the Serbian invasion of Bosnia and Croatia, and were dealing with a very similar phenomenon. Milosevic, saw the world as black and white, those who deserve to be either recognized as Serbs, as true Serbs. That's what Putin wants to do with the Ukrainians. They're really Russians, or they have to be annihilated. So we experienced that before, but I think the scope of what we're seeing today, and I'm not optimistic that this will be over soon, is even worse. We don't know how many have already been killed in the Yugoslavia conflict. At least 200,000 were killed. Millions ended up as refugees. We see this already in Ukraine. So in my lifetime, I have experienced something similar, and also driven by a crazy nationalist ideology that denied the existence and identity of the other, in this case, Catholics or Muslims.
Sonia, if I could bring you into the conversation. When I think of Vienna and Austria, this is a bad thing to say, but I think of Sachertorte, and I think of, I like to eat, and I think of OPEC, because that's where OPEC is headquartered. OPEC, of course, the cartel-like organization that controls, together with, in its new form, which is called OPEC Plus, partnered with Russia, basically Saudi Arabia, Russia, a bunch of other energy-producing countries, roughly together controls about half the world's hydrocarbons, in particular oil. Like all of this, there's a prospect or a danger or a threat, whatever you want to call it, probability now that the EU will ban, and maybe it'll be a graduated thing, Russian oil exports into the EU, and they're significant to keep the lights on and the machines running in Western Europe right now, all that energy. What at the beginning, I said I wanted you to at some point put on your ESG hat. Before February 24, if we rewind the clock back to, what was it, November, we were at COP26 and the world was focused, at least for 2 weeks, on this this climate emergency that we have. But now that all changes if all of energy prices are going through the roof everywhere. I mean, I know mine have gone up here in the UK by more than 50% in the last couple of months. What does all this mean for this transition to to green energy and a world where we're not threatening, where we're mitigating climate change by moving to renewables, for example? The fact that we have this conflict now, what happens?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I guess when we see so many companies, and hopefully it does become a kind of silver lining of this, that we do kind of move the climate agenda even faster with transitioning away from hydrocarbons and from our heavy reliance on OPEC members and conflict areas of economy. But it's interesting because when we do materiality assessments of companies and what their what are their material issues, these kind of things like the conflict, consumer opinion, what's going on in social media about your company, it really does feed into what they're needing to set for their carbon emission targets and their reductions. Additionally, we're seeing the task force for climate disclosures, financial climate disclosures is coming into play for large companies this year. And that means they're having to disclose what their emissions are and what their risks are. And these types of conflicts are only going to push that agenda faster. And so while it's a negative experience, obviously, but anything to kind of bring that transition around more quickly and ensure that people have more plans in place and are taking these things more seriously is will hopefully have a good impact in the long run. And just to add on sustainability, it's quite interesting from the fisheries sector. In my last role, when we were deciding what to do on kind of companies that are audited in Russia, we were hearing from a lot of our the certificate holders in Russia, the auditors in Russia, when I'm on the phone with the audit companies there, they are against the war, and they think that if we put sanctions in place against having certified fish coming out of Russia, that we're pushing out years of work towards sustainability. And I can only, this is happening for every sustainability program. It's really a deep cutoff, and now these people that were working toward the sustainability agenda for 10, 15 years, it's now lost, and they'll have to recertify and re-engage, and it'll be a big uphill battle. And so there's a lot of that kind of, are they better in the tent or out? But with the direction the sanctions are going, it's really unprecedented for our sector in terms of what we do and how we exclude those companies.
Thank you very much for that. So we've got just 10 minutes to go, and we now enter into the portion of the conversation where we do speed questions, right? Because we have a number of questions from the audience. So 30-second answers. Anybody jump in with a quick one? Who will follow President Putin? Professor Cohen, quickly. Who's going to follow President Putin? When's it going to happen?
I have no idea how to answer either of those two questions.
Wrong answer. Klaus?
My guess is that if in fact Putin leaves rather than dies in office, that he would be followed by somebody from the military.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I would be. I'm simply not equipped to answer that.
Yeah. Professor Michels, you're a longtime Russia watcher, centuries of Russian history there. Who follows President Putin?
Well, Stalin lasted 25 years. Putin seems to be ill, even though that's covered up. We don't know. Maybe this is just temporary. He has systematically eliminated all potential successors. I had secretly hoped that there would be an opposition against him forming. There's a lot of discontent, especially in the military leadership and also in the KGB or FSB. But I don't see any successor. So he will rule as long as Peter the Great, who ruled for 36 years. And, I don't know. I don't see a successor.
Professor Cohen, is there a way, another question from the audience, is there a way for outside media to access mainstream Russian television to bring awareness to the Russian people to the reality of the situation in Ukraine?
No.
Can you hack Russian state TV?
No. You wanted a short answer.
Yeah.
My answer is no. There's no way that the existing media in Russia could be hacked in that way.
Is there any way to reach the Russian people in your view?
Well, some social media can be used. They have in China. Many people evade the Great Wall of censorship by using these private networks, and in Russia, the same thing could be underwritten by the West, making an alternative channel available. But the present situation is one where there's no way for Western information to evade the controls that the Russian government has put in place.
So, a quick question from me. At the beginning of this conversation, we talked about part of what we want to achieve here is to share with people how you can get involved if you want to get involved. So how the heck did you do it? How did you get to the Ukrainian-Polish border?
Yeah, that found a very grassroots NGO and just kind of showed up, asked if we could come. A lot of donations really do go to helping people at the border. And so just donate and do what you can. There's some people that just show up at the border and you can help drive. They're putting in more rules to make sure there's no kind of trafficking of humans and being picked up by random cars and taken where they don't want to be going. But there's an opportunity to help and just show up and help carry bags, this kind of stuff, in addition to helping pass out food and be with a bit of a more organized thing.
Yeah. Professor Cohen, what's the possibility of expansion of the war to former Soviet satellite countries?
Unfortunately, I think that's something that is a realistic scenario. We were told earlier about the way in which some of the fighting or influence of the fighting has spilled over into Transnistria and Moldova. I think it could easily go into some of the neighboring countries through which arms are being filtered into Ukraine. I could easily imagine an expansion of the war if the Russians decide to try to interdict weapons shipments on the western side of the common borders rather than within Ukraine. I'm talking about, in other words, Poland, Slovakia, Romania in particular, those three, not so much Hungary, but the other three are conduits for the shipment of arms into Ukraine. And I could easily imagine, whether intentionally or by accident, Russians trying to take out some of those rail lines coming from Poland, Slovakia, or Romania. And then we would have a scenario much like that started World War I, which started with an assassination in Sarajevo, and then dominoes started falling. And regrettably, it's possible that dominoes could fall here if the Russians chose to start to expand the military operations beyond Ukraine.
And Professor Cohen, just 15 seconds, because I want to get Professor Michal's historical perspective on this. What's the possibility of a coup in Russia?
Increasing.
Okay, and could it come from the oligarchs?
No, I think it's, as I said, I think that it would come from the military. I don't think the military wants to see itself destroyed in a humiliating defeat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's the military that is a threat to his rule, not the oligarchs. The oligarchs don't have divisions.
Professor Michals?
Well, I would say if at all, it needs to come from within the KGB, the so-called FSB today. Putin is very much a creature of the FSB. But on the other hand, I mean, in other words, there needs to be, the military would have to win over the KGB, otherwise there would be a civil war. I don't see it. I think Putin is firmly entrenched. Unless he dies. Of course, he's sitting in his bunker like Hitler. I mean, he's denying reality, and there are lots of people around him who see the grim realities in Ukraine, and I see discontent forming, but I don't see a power base for a coup.
Well, thank you very much. So some quick pointers before I hand it over. First off, if you enjoyed this session and you want to share it but didn't record it, worry not, we did, and we're going to post it on the UC Trust UK YouTube channel, and we will send you all a link, so please share it far and wide. And before I pass over, special thanks to Zara Zimbrick from University of California Trust UK, Jason Mulring, President of UC Alumni UK, Victoria Frost, President of the UCLA Alumni UK Club, Jamie Illich, co-president of the UC Riverside Alumni UK Club, Cara Goslin, co-president of the UC Santa Barbara UK Club, all of whom supported this event behind the scenes. And a huge thanks from me to our panelists, Professor Cohen, Professor Michels, Sonia, and Klaus. I really enjoyed this. We could go for, I'm sure, hours more, but hopefully you enjoyed it. And that's it from us. So over to you, Jason, for some final announcements from the UC Alumni UK network. It's been a pleasure to be with you all.
Great. This is what it's all about. This is why we do UC UK chats. You know, the motto for University of California is "Let there be light," and I think that we have shown some light on this topic with a panel of experts, of people who really know their stuff. And so I just want to thank all of you, Klaus, Sonia, Professor Michels, Professor Cohen, and Ryan, for stepping in, answering my call, and showing up, and just being fantastic in organizing this. So thank you so much. I want to thank the audience. You know, we could have done this in a room by ourselves, but many of you showed up, and this is really what the type of engagement that we like, and the type of topical debate that we enjoy. So thank you so much. There are opportunities to volunteer and to make a difference, you know, following on what Sonia has to say. If you follow the links that are in the invite, there are some there. There are, you know, we have our former president for the group who works for Save the Children. There are a number of NGOs that you can support in that way. And with that, I just want to thank you all very much for coming to UC UK Chats, and we hope to see you next time.